Welcome to the Primer Podcast, everyone, where we dig into important ideas with interesting people, all to hopefully spark your interest and your thinking. I'm Charley Thornton, and today we're going to be talking about the great books. You remember those ones? The ones you were afraid of in school? That's what we're going to talk about. Before we get to that, though, if you like what you hear here today, please leave us a review and be sure to subscribe. We're trying to get the word out to have more thoughtful conversations about the really important stuff in our culture. Okay, in this episode, I talked with a guy named Scott Hambrick, who is the founder of OnlineGreatBooks.com. And Scott is not an academic, but he really loves these books, these texts, and he's created a really cool way for regular people like you and me to approach some of the great works that have shaped our culture. I think he's doing some really cool stuff. I hope you'll enjoy it. Let's take a listen. Well, so what we're here to talk about today are great books.
Yeah.
So you're with an organization called the Online Great Books, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you got into this, and have that whole conversation. So let's get started. Oh, you changed your background. Awesome.
Yeah.
So let's kick it off with like the most obvious question. What are the great books?
Oh man, that's always the question, right? Well, the great books are mostly not debatable, right? I mean, there are books that are very, very important to, um, to. There are books that have been very, very important in developing the way the West deals with problems of truth and reality and science and virtue. And most of those books, I don't think, would be very debatable. I think that almost everybody would say, "Oh, well, the dialogues of Plato have got to be in there, right? Aristotle has got to be in there. Shakespeare has got to be in there." So most people don't disagree very much about most of them, but there are some books maybe on the fringes. Do you put Freud in there? I don't know. You can argue about some of those titles. Um, but for us at onlinegreatbooks.com, they are the books that are part of the great conversation, and it's an emergent list. So it's not a list that that a bunch of guys sat around in a room and smoked cigars and debated about who gets to make the cut and who doesn't. It's not like fantasy football.
Okay.
Like, for example, if you did read Freud, if you picked up Freud, for example, he would say something about Nietzsche, and you might say something about Kant and the categorical imperative. So if you cared, you'd need to go read some Nietzsche, and then he would definitely say something more about Kant and Schopenhauer and Aristotle, and that would lead you to go read those guys. And then they, in turn, would mention, I don't know, Machiavelli, maybe, or get you back to Aristotle, Plato, and then you read that, and sure enough, you read Aristophanes is in Plato's Symposium. He's a character in the Symposium. Well, who is this guy? He wrote plays. You'd go read his plays, and you end back at Homer. So the list is sort of self-evident because these people that have written these books have referred to each other and really fought about these important questions for about 3,000 years. And so most of these books are answers to questions that earlier participants in the conversation have brought up. Aristotle is very much an answer to Plato, his teacher, and
so they kind of form like this foundation that so many other great works just kind of reach back to.
Yeah. Yes. And for some reason, foolish people right now are debating about the value of them, and I mean them as a whole, the canon as a whole. Like, I'm certainly willing to debate about whether or not an individual text, Hobbes's Leviathan, maybe. I'm certainly willing to debate the value of an individual text, but there is no question in my mind that there is a set of very important books that has helped the West become what it is. And to throw that out is a very dangerous move. But there seem to be a lot of, frankly, very stupid people that want to do that right now.
Fans of that right now. Interesting.
There you go.
I'll share a little bit of my own experience. So I went to what is regarded as a very good university, right? Northwestern University. And really, it wasn't necessarily their fault, but I didn't know what courses to take, and there was no curriculum laid out for me. So I sort of randomly took a bunch of courses as I went through my college experience. And at the end of which, I had a really good experience and I learned some things. But just a few years ago, I started looking back and I felt like there was a real gap in my education.
Sure.
Because I hadn't read, except in high school, I hadn't read any of these sort of foundational works. And so a few years ago, I kind of started a journey, and like I'm very early in this journey, but you can see some of the ones behind me. I took a 9-week course that took me only about 2 years to finish, and worked through, some of the ones at least to start with.
Yeah.
And part of, as I look at my experience, I certainly could have and should have done more. But part of me asks, why wasn't this path clearer? Why would it have had to be something that I stitched together on my own? Whereas some of my other friends at other universities, this was more of a known track that even if it wasn't required for everyone, it was there if you wanted it. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah, I went to the University of Oklahoma in the early '90s. I have a microbiology background, and I think I got a good. It's actually not an education. What I got wasn't an education. They call it STEM. It's actually training.
Mm-hmm. Was
Where
it
I
good
learned.
training?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think an education is something that's much more broader and fits us more for life than for particular skills. But because of modern society, industrialization, and so on, we've just got to specialize. We've just got to niche down if you're gonna be a quote unquote productive person, and a contributor to the economy. So to the point that you can get paid,
Mm-hmm.
you've got to receive some very specialized training, and I can't remember exactly how many hours were in my degree plan, but man, I had very, very few opportunities for electives. I had to take biochemistry and 3 calculus classes, and organic chemistry and physical chemistry, and blah 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 blah. I mean, my schedule was full, and there was no room in that training for this sort of liberal arts education. And you ask why does that happen? And I think it's just a consequence of modernity. You can go read some folks like John Dewey, who wrote about how we were going to have to around the turn of the 20th century, how we were going to have to change education because the world had changed. And by golly, those people have done that. And so we end up with millions of us like me who get a good education. Maybe we got engineering background, maybe it's nursing, maybe you're a HVAC technician and excellent at what you do, but we don't have that sort of liberal arts education. Liberal and shares a root with liberty. Liberal education is the education that befits free people, and maybe that's why we don't get that too. But most people get to adulthood and their mid 30s without having access. Well, they have access to it, but without having taken those kinds of courses and that kind of responsibility on. And and those are the people who are at online great books. They're nurses, they're homeschool moms, they're HVAC guys, they're welders, they're engineers, and they're like, we didn't get this.
It's filling that gap.
And they feel somewhere around 32, 33, 34 years old, these people become aware of that hole, and they want to fill it. And that's why I started the business. To help them
Interesting.
do.
I mean, that was certainly my experience. So what's it like? Why should we go back and look at these things if we haven't? Like, what are we missing out? What good things are we missing if we let this canon pass us by, and we're just a little bit more focused on training?
Well, you got to have training, right? Like, you need to know how to use the stove so you can cook dinner. There's a certain amount of training that's necessary. But if we want to live the good life, Plato tells us that the examined life is the life worth living for a man. We need to learn to examine life, and these books teach us how to do that. Um, Nobody's better at teaching people how to examine life than Socrates, and we've got, I don't know, 1,800 pages of Socrates dialogues that Plato wrote for us that we can go read, and we can see this man. We can not see, but we can read stories about Socrates walking around in the marketplace and just talking to his acquaintances about the most important things in life. One of my favorite dialogues. They're all my favorites. They're like children. You can't pick one. But one that I think that if you haven't read any Plato, I think one that you should probably start with is the Meno, Meno. And in the Meno, some friends walk up to Socrates and they say, "Hey, man, we've noticed that our leaders aren't very good. So we've been wondering, can virtue be taught?" And then Socrates, being Socrates, says, "Wait a minute. We can't even talk about that yet. We got to figure out what virtue is first." Right? So he models for us, how to deal with an important problem, and and figuring out what virtue is maybe the most important problem. And you see it right there in Meno in the first like 2 or 3 paragraphs of the Meno. They tackle it, and Socrates is really good at leaving you unfulfilled. But that's part of the point. But he shows us how to do that. So when you watch television or wherever you get your news, and you see someone screaming about social justice, your inner Socrates, after you have this training, says, "Well, wait a minute. Before we figure out how to bring that about, we have to determine what justice is. Right? Before I pick up the brick and throw it, I have to know what justice is." And once you've done this work for, in earnest for months or years, you realize that almost every single argument that we see in the public sphere has run past itself. Like, we don't know what justice is, right? We're arguing about how to bring it about, but nobody has commensurate definitions of what justice is. Nobody even agrees on what it is. And almost no one has even declared what they even think it is. So we continue to have arguments that are like third and fourth order arguments. We haven't even settled the basics. And Socrates teaches us right away. So he quickly disabuses you of having really any opinions.
Yeah, and so it just becomes this issue where we're just talking past each other, and we don't even. Well, I guess we don't even really have a common language. To some extent,
that's for sure. And it's not just talking past each other. We also, if you're not careful, we'll just kind of think past yourself instead of talking past, Charley over here. I can just twist off on notions of justice and what and harp about political change without ever really nailing down what precisely justice is. And the Republic, Plato's Republic, is just about that. And you go read that and you see people way smarter than us wrestle that out to the nth degree, and it's astounding. And it changes the way you look at the world. Our founding fathers couldn't have written that Constitution that we've gotten without having thought about all these issues at length. And they were, and we know that Jefferson and Madison and all these men had read these things. You can go to Colonial Williamsburg and go to George Wyeth's house and see the table they sat at when they argued about Plato's Republic when they were going to William and Mary College there in the mid 1700s.
Got it.
They did it.
So
even those guys, after me doing this that I do and doing this stuff that we all do at Online Great Books, you can read the Declaration of Independence and you see references in there to natural rights, but they don't make a proof of the natural rights.
It's referencing something that was explained previously in this canon.
Oh, I don't think so.
No.
I think they pulled that. Yeah, I don't think so. But they don't show their work there, and that's fine. Sometimes we have to have bedrocks, axioms that we really can't prove, or that we believe are self evident, and move from there. Sometimes we can't show our math. Like, um, yeah,
Interesting.
it's more stuff out of these books. Aristotle in his
Yeah.
book Metaphysics talks about how far do you have to reduce? Where do you how low do you have to go when you start building an argument? And
Yeah.
you, so these guys talk about that stuff. And so once you've read them, and anybody can do it, and everybody ought to do it. Once you've read it and you've taken it seriously and you've taken your time and you've discussed them with other people and you've been critical, it just changes the way you see everything. I'm just like a redneck from Oklahoma, but I've worked on this stuff for years, and
Yeah.
yeah, it's changed me.
So you just said anybody can do it.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think some people crack these books open and they're hard. And
They are.
yeah, so is that a translation issue? Is it a modernity issue where we're just not used to reading like this? I mean, I think there are some hurdles. It's a little bit easier to pick up Harry Potter than metaphysics, right?
Listen, metaphysics is brutal.
Okay.
Um,
All right, good. So I'm not the
yeah.
only one.
So oh, it's brutal. Now, when I was, I don't know, like a late junior high kid, I picked up a copy of Plato's Republic. I thought, I'll read this thing. I've heard of this. I'll read this thing. And
Yeah.
I cracked it open and I tried it, and I'm not going to say it was incomprehensible, because the Republic, it reads pretty well, but it just eluded me, And over the years, I'd tried it several times and hadn't really gotten hold of it. I'd tried some Descartes and some other things as well, and then finally, I just started with Homer and read the Iliad, and then I read the Odyssey, and then I picked up the Greek plays and read Aeschylus, Sophocles, blah blah blah, and I just went and I just read them in chronological order, and in doing that, I was encountering the books in the same order that people who are writing as part of this great conversation encountered them in, right? Like Plato knew the Odyssey and the Iliad.
Yeah.
He hung around with Aristophanes. He went to plays, So I then at least share in some of the stuff that these guys already knew. I'm scaffolding up in this great conversation just like they are, and I find that helps. I found that helped enormously. So on my great books, we read them in chronological order. If you go to college, they typically don't do something like this in university. They don't do that. Like they will typically do like we're just going to read about justice. They'll read the Republic, and they'll read maybe Aristotle's Politics, and then maybe you'll read a little Hobbes or something, maybe a little Hume, whatever, and you just make this big survey across time. And when you're going to university and you have time constraints, that's probably a good way to do it. But I think doing them in order like this is a big, big help.
That's cool. That makes sense.
And also, we have to spend a lot of time. We don't have to, but we do spend a lot of time trying to get our new members to be kind to themselves and to remember that there are no grades. This is where the university, there are no grades. There is no test, right? We do this for our own purposes. We are grown ass people. And we do this for our own purposes. And knowing that there's no test and that you don't have to read it in a certain way or at a certain pace to please the instructor really takes a lot of stress off of people.
Yeah.
And we just ask them to read 30 minutes a day, 6 days a week. And by, we read a lot of material, and anybody can do it. Another thing that makes these, you ask about, what are the great books? Another thing about them that makes them great is that they are so accessible, except for Kant and except for the Metaphysics by Aristotle. But most all of them have something in there for anyone. Uh, a 14-year-old can read the Iliad, and it's just an awesome action adventure. But um, an Iraq war vet or an ER nurse is going to have a much different experience of that book. It's multifaceted and it's super deep, and
Yeah.
and it will meet you at your level.
Well, let's
I don't
talk.
know how. Go ahead.
Let's talk about that, because it's, on the one hand, it's sort of easy to sit back and say, the universities aren't doing enough to get these great books in front of people, maybe the way that they did before. I think that's a fair statement, right? Like, that's something that you might hear somebody say. But
Right.
for me personally, when I started reading through these books, and I haven't done your program, it's really interesting. But when I started reading these books, there was, I read Dante's Inferno when I was 35 years old, which is
Right.
exactly how old he is when he's writing it. I think there was a lot of value in that. And to be able to read it at a pace that wasn't dictated by some professor on a schedule where you have to read an ungodly amount that you can't possibly really digest or focus on. And as I was reading it, I just thought, I don't know what I would have thought when I was 19. I really didn't know anything, you know? So what have you found with people coming to these books maybe a little bit later than than previous generations did?
Well, I think it's actually probably good. Um, you said earlier that Harry Potter was maybe more accessible, and I was talking to a friend about writing for business purposes a number of years ago, and he says, "Well, you got to write at an eighth grade level. We've heard this, right, about
Yeah.
brevity and writing at eighth grade level and so on, but there are some ideas. That the normal eighth grader can't communicate, right? Like the eighth grade consciousness isn't complex enough, frankly, to deal with all the problems that we have in front of us. And I think it takes a certain amount of life experience and getting your ass kicked to really get what you need to get out of these books. Aristotle in, I think it's in the Ethics. I think he says that you shouldn't even teach anybody philosophy until they're like in their late 20s,
Hmm.
because you're just spinning your wheels. Um, it's not. That's not to say that I don't think a 16-year-old ought not to read Aristotle's Politics, but you've got to understand that their experience of that is going to be much different, um, than it would be if you're 35 and you're opening Dante for the first time, as opposed to some 20-year-old that's doing it.
Yeah.
I think that if you force young people to tackle these things too early, well, actually, if you force anybody to do it, it's going to put them off of it, and they'll probably never come back.
Yeah.
Uh, so there are a number of things, right? So, are they ready? Do they have a large enough fund of knowledge and a large enough scope of experience to actually take the book in and incorporate it into themselves? And then also, is it just too early? Are they not ready? Do they not want to? Are you gonna put them off big ideas? Are you gonna put them off wrestling big ideas, because they've got a quiz on Friday and you keep hitting them over the head with it? But people in their 30s, late 20s, and in their 30s, man, they start getting really hungry for this. They've made their way. The house is comfortable. Maybe they're married. Maybe they got a kid on the ground.
Yeah.
Got some distance between them and university. And have started to evaluate where they are in the world, and they start being pretty hungry for this. I know. I know what I know. I was and am. Yeah,
Yeah. So how did you get from, your degree in, what did you say, microbiology?
microbiology background. Yeah.
So microbiology to, what I'm going to do? I'm going to help people read books that are really, really old.
Right. Well, I've got two daughters, and my wife was teaching kindergarten at the kind of snotty, you know, private prep school, K through 12 prep school here in Tulsa, and the daughters were both going to school there, and they were getting one of the one of the bad things about these supposed good private schools is that school doesn't necessarily equal education. You know, fish hang out in schools instead of kids. It's not really about education necessarily. It's about training to participate in a certain kind of a game. And I I increasingly think that the game that they're participating in isn't the right one anymore. If you think that you're going to go to the right school and go to get the right degree and get the job and fight to keep it and then retire, I think that is becoming a longer and longer shot than it was. So they're really good at helping people play that game. And I was talking to my kids, and I realized that there was just a whole bunch of stuff they didn't know, and they were in middle school that I thought they should. And we pulled them out and homeschooled them. We pulled them out and decided we were going to homeschool the kids. I don't really like homeschool because we don't do school. We don't have a bell. They don't sit up at the top of the hour and then sit down after a 5-minute break, right? We don't stand in line. We don't do school. We did home education. And once we decided to do that, well, then I had to figure out how to do that, you know? And I decided that after quite a bit of research, decided I loved the trivium, the 3 classical liberal arts, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and felt like they needed to. No, I didn't feel like it. I believed that they needed to study that. But me being as old as I was, I knew I had missed that. And I knew I didn't have time running a business and all the things that I was doing to go study Latin. So I decided that I needed to remediate my education, you know, and I found Mortimer Adler's Great Books of the Western World program and decided that I would start a great books group in my home. Because that, to me, that looked like a great way for a busy adult to fill some of those holes. And I started a group. That group's been meeting for almost 6 years on the third Thursday of each month in my house. And all the guys love it. And we've been reading together, like I said, for almost 6 years. And about 3.5, 4 years ago, one of the guys in my group is Brett McKay, the Art of Manliness guy. And he's like, "Hey, Hambrick, you really need to find a way to do this online for everybody." I was like, "Well, I don't need another business." He's like, "Yeah, you do." Yeah, you do. So got to work on that and kicked that off in January of 2018. So we've been operating a little over 3 years. We've just got thousands of people, just regular folks, you know, truck drivers, welders, physicians, attorneys, retired people, homeschool moms, nurses, reading these books. And we ship a book right to their house. We give them reading goals every week. And then once a month, they go to a seminar and discuss these things in a Socratic seminar that's led by one of my seminar hosts. And
It's like
you know,
the biggest book club. It's just a
Yep.
massive book
Yeah,
club.
it's not a book club. It's not a book club because
It's not a book club.
it's not a book club. You know, a book club, you know, you drink wine and you talk about whatever was on Oprah's list.
You can tell
And
I've never
it's
been to a book club, so that's probably why.
Yeah,
All right.
but we do seminar, you know,
Okay.
where there's a seminar host who acts the part of Socrates. He's going to apply the Socratic method to you. We're going to engage in dialectic. Well, what that means is there's a guy in there or a gal who's going to ask you the hard questions about the text, and we're going to direct a conversation around the text in the hopes of bringing the consciousness of everybody in the room to bear on the problems of the text. You know, St. John's College is one of the great books colleges in the country. It's probably the best one. And they say that the close reading of difficult text is actually done in seminar. It's not when it's you alone with a light bulb in the book and a cup of coffee. It's when you actually bring what you've read and your questions to seminar, and you bring the consciousness of the group to bear on that problem, you know. And my God, they're right. So the close reading is done in that seminar. And our job is to help do that, is to help that seminar become that. You know, so you hold the book and you look at the book and you can feel the book and you can smell the book. Doesn't make much noise, but I mean, you have a sensory experience of the book, and of course you read it. But when you go to seminar, That's when you actually talk about it and take action on what you've read. And we've found that the seminar not only just clarifies what's in the text a lot more for you, but it also increases reading comprehension enormously because you actually act on the thing that you've read. I've read thousands of books, and most of them I read them and then I've closed them and then I put them on the shelf without having that action step, where I enter into dialogue with other people, not in dialogue, dialectic with other people around that text. And the ones that I've talked about in seminar with others versus the ones I just finished and put on the shelf are more a part of me than those I was passive with.
I
The
could see
seminars,
that.
the seminars are secret sauce, man. I'm telling you, like the books are cheap, right? You can go to a used bookstore and go pick up a copy of the Republic, a Signet Classics copy of the Republic, which ain't bad for $1 or $2. But the seminar is hard to get,
Yeah. Was I just
and
for
it makes up the difference.
for the benefit of our audience and for the benefit of me, what's the difference between dialogue and dialectic?
Well,
Did we just take a big left turn?
Well, maybe we took a turn, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe not. A dialogue's normally a set piece, right? You go read a play and there's dialogue scripted out in there. It's a set piece. In dialectic, dialectio, when two speak, the goal is to find the truth. So you've probably, you've heard of a syllogism, probably, maybe in geometry, or maybe you've read a little Aristotle or some logic where you say something like, all men are mortals.
Mm-hmm.
Socrates is a mortal. Wait a minute.
Socrates
I already
is a man.
screwed it up. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is a mortal.
Right.
So if your two early premises are right and you put them in the correct order, the conclusion's a deadlock. Certainty. It's, deductive reasoning. It's perfect. But there's a lot of truth claims that can't be verified like that. Like, what is justice? What is love? What is virtue? What's the best form of government? And you can use dialectic to help get to the truth in that. So Socrates shows us how to do that. So typically you ask a bunch of splitting questions, make you pick sides. So Charley, is justice the will of the stronger, or is it the will of the weaker? And those questions might seem absurd, but what you end up doing is you really can't necessarily validate a claim, but you can definitely rule out all the stuff that it ain't, which sure is helpful. Because if we're dealing with an abstraction or something that's highly conceptual, like virtue or love or justice, that's really the best we can do. But that's what we do. We tend to do that kind of thing in seminar, but not always. Like I see you've got a copy of Fegel's Iliad there behind you. If I was going to lead a seminar on the Iliad, it's not a work of philosophy. It's not a work of, it's not scientific writing, but there's some heavy stuff in there. So if I was your seminar host, would kick the thing off with saying, all right, so you've read all 600 pages of this thing. A lot of people have been bashed to the ground, and
a lot of death.
People getting beat up with stones and their armor rattling about their body as they crash to the ground. What is war? Well, it's pretty tough. I mean, like, what is it? No, man, you got to answer. Come on.
Oh, I got to answer it.
Yeah.
What is war? War is a clash of two wills that results in violence to see who will blink first.
It's two wills?
Could be more. In this case,
that would be a duel. Does scale matter? Like if it's just me and you, that's just two clowns like mad at each other.
Yeah. Well, it helps if the two people whose wills are in conflict are also kings or leaders of large groups of people.
Mm. So scale matter. Well, you say it helps. You can't say that.
Yeah. That makes probably the difference between a duel, I guess.
Yeah. So
So
if
scale would
there
matter. Absolutely.
yeah. And then you say will, so it's the will of the leaders that dictate, because there are certainly people, well, like Achilles in the first, I don't know, 85-90% of the books. You can't, by the way, you can't do spoilers on a 3,000-year-old book. So, right?
I don't know.
So yeah, in the first,
I mean, if one of our
80,
goals is to
90%,
get people to read this stuff, Scott, you better be careful here.
right?
Yeah.
Well, he doesn't want to fight. So where's his will in the thing? So the whose will matters in a war? Whose will matters? Because Achilles did not matter. Like, the show went on. Patroclus fights.
Right.
I mean, everybody's fight. I mean, the war is on.
Yeah.
And there are numberless, nameless people in there that are getting harmed and taking part in it too.
Right. And it doesn't seem like
will.
I guess the ones who are willing to draw blood
Anyways,
and
you get
not
the
back
point.
down. Yeah, I get the idea.
But it makes you, if you do that dance about, what is war, and that's just one way to do the Iliad. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But asking a big question like that at the beginning of the seminar can just open up the whole text. Like, with that question, there's nothing in the thing that I don't think that we could have eventually touched that was in the book. What is honor? What role does man what's the role of man in the state and in war? All those kinds of things can be touched on in there. And then when we ask those questions and we go back and forth, you and I, or whoever it is in the seminar, and the seminar host, and eventually after they get good at it, the seminar host just kind of sits back and everybody does that to each other. When you get done, people remember the text better. They've got a lot better idea about what they think about armed conflict and the political.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you'll read it again in 5 years. You'll continue to evolve as you do that.
So I've been in different groups that sort of have that, I guess, the Socratic method, right? Where you're sort of constantly asking questions and digging deeper. And there's a little bit of discomfort that goes with that, right? Like, you just kind of put me on the spot, right? And I do find that there are a lot of people today who are really uncomfortable with that.
Yep.
And I think is that one of the barriers to reading some of these texts?
Well, certainly not to reading. Well, maybe to reading,
or to unpacking them, perhaps.
Yeah, even if you're not in a seminar, you don't have a seminar host, and it's just you reading a text. I mean, I think that eventually you need to be asking those questions of yourself and of the text as you go.
Yeah.
And if you're just not willing to do that, then you're not going to get the same stuff out of the Iliad that the person who's willing to is going to get out of it. But you know what? That's okay, because, like I said, it's a pretty cool action epic poem. It's the best of those. So if that's what you're getting out of it, and you can read, I think it's in book 6, Hector and Andromache in the apartment, arguing about whether he should go back or if he should stay with the family. It's a tearjerker. You don't have to dig into what is war to get a lot out of these things.
Yeah. Well, on that note, and I guess no surprise, we're probably not going to finish the conversation about the great books here in the time that we have. But what are some good places for people to start if there's this nagging sense like, I am ignorant of this big pillar of our culture or whatever, and there's this gap in my education? Where do you usually point people to get started so they don't get discouraged?
Well, they can certainly join us at onlinegreatbooks.com. But, man, I tell you, the best thing is if you can get a group together in your home. It really is. And so if if this is something that you want to do, of course, the books are cheap. Used bookstores are full of them. The library has them. A lot of these are on Kindle for free. Um, I would recommend that people start with Mortimer Adler's book, How to Read a Book. Most of the time, we read for weird purposes. We're reading a blog post and just trying to get the high points out of it. We're reading something because we know there's a quiz on Friday, or we're flipping through a technical manual just to get the chunk that we need to do our job. And this kind of reading's different. And Adler shows us how it's different. And that book is very helpful. It has, in the back of that book, it has his list of the great books, which is a pretty darn good list. We've added to it some and subtracted a tiny bit, but it's a very good list. And if you called up 3 or 4 or 8 of your friends and said, hey, I'm putting the coffee pot on Thursday, why don't you guys read page 1 through 184 and how to read a book? And then we're going to start off, and we're going to talk about it. You'd be well on your way. And then after that, find your way. We read them in chronological order. Not everybody does that. I think our way's best. It's not the fastest, but it is the most complete, and I think it's the best way. I have a friend in Australia, Joel, who has a home group, and he's like, man, I'm not good at being the Socratic, being the host. I'm not good at the Socratic method. What are we going to do? Well, Adler has 5 questions. I think it's 5 questions. Let me see. I can edit this out or not. He's got some questions he asks in his book. Oh, hell. That he says that you should, when you're reading critically, that you should be asking, what's the author trying to say? What are the arguments he uses to support his point? There are 5. I think there are 5 of those questions. The last one is, what of it? Because sometimes you see that the author makes his point, but who cares? And Joel's group has decided that they are going to use that format every time. And so if you're going to take a book like the Odyssey, and Adler asks us, after a careful reading, Adler asks, can you state the unity of the book in a paragraph or so? Sometimes for some of these darn books, man, it can take 5, 6, 7, 8 of us that love each other very much and are not in conflict 2 or 3 hours to get it boiled down to a paragraph. And that sounds kind of silly, but if me and you and 4 of our best friends sat down for a couple hours and discuss what a 1 paragraph summary of the darn book should be, I guarantee you at the end of that, you're going to know more about the book than when you walked into the meeting. Yeah. So, you might take turns being the Socratic host and do the thing like, what is war, like I did, or you could maybe take some of those questions, those inspectional reading questions in the Adler book, print them out, laminate them, use them for bookmarks. And then every, the 4th Wednesday of the month, you guys are going to answer those 5 questions or whatever about the text that you used. All of that takes a lot of work. Hosting the meeting takes a lot of work, making sure that the kids aren't in the way for 2 hours on a Wednesday night, all that. And, if you have trouble with that, by golly, we're here to help do that. I bet that a third, that's probably a little high, 20 or 25% of our members at Online Great Books are members and do seminar with us, and then also have a home group now too.
Yeah. Oh, very cool. So one kind of leads to the other.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Scott, it's great talking to you, picking your brain. What I love about this is that you're coming at it not as a guy who studied classics and has speaks 4 languages, although maybe you do, and 3 PhDs.
Experts are bullshit. These books are very, very general and relatable. I mean, they are actually about life. They don't belong in colleges exclusively. If you've got kids and they're fighting over a candy bar, what's justice? If you've got a 4-year-old and a 14-year-old, do they get the same size piece? Well, and it's a king size candy bar. Maybe half of the candy bar will make the 4-year-old sick. Watch justice. Like, this stuff really matters at all levels. It's not for experts. They have really screwed us by convincing us, whoever they is, we have been screwed by being convinced that this is the province of experts, because it's just not. All this stuff matters to us every single day.
Well, and it all
And
gets back to that conversation, which is really just a conversation about life and how to live a good one, right?
it's about what matters. Yeah, it's about what matters.
Yeah.
And you know, you people can do this. Almost every month, I get an email from a new member at Online Great Books who finishes the Iliad, and they say that's the first book they've ever read cover to cover. It happens all the time, and I get choked up almost every time I get one of those emails. And they're not who you think they are. Most of these people went to college. They're like, "Oh, this is the first book I've ever read from page 1 till it said the end."
Wow.
And thank you so much. That's a crying ass shame. If you can go be a master electrician and go through all the education and training it takes to do that, and have not read a book from cover to cover, if you can go to nursing school and not read a book from cover to cover, if you can get a microbiology degree and not have read something important from cover to cover, and then not just get that kind of training or education, but get to 35 and having not done it, that's terrible. They'll binge watch whatever, but they won't binge read. It's just, I'm disgusted.
And I can tell you from personal experience, I mean, that was actually the one that I started with, and it wasn't the first book I've read cover to cover, but I'm a very auditory person, so I find it very difficult to sit down and read. And there was a tremendous feeling of accomplishment when I finished it.
You bet.
I felt like I'd climbed a mountain or something, and I felt like I could look at myself a little differently and say, you can do this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I love your approach that it's not read the first 12 chapters, it's read 30 minutes a day. Why does that work, and how did you land on that? Last question.
Because almost everybody can find 30 minutes, whether it's you're in the toilet or in the parking lot, or whether it's your lunch break, it's something. Almost everybody can find 30 minutes. And even with our collapsed and broken and crippled up attention spans, we can normally get through 30 minutes. So some months we're reading something fairly easy like the Odyssey, and we'll read a lot with that 30 minutes a day. We get a lot done. And then there are other months when it's Aristotle's Metaphysics. Dude, it's 3 pages. It's 3, 4, 5, 6 pages an hour. And it's okay. It's okay. Because that's what that book requires. There's nothing wrong with that, because that's what it requires. So you auditory people, I think that reading has a quality to it that makes it better than any other way to learn. It lets you pace. Like if I was reading the Iliad to you, you have to listen at my pace. But if you're reading it, you can read at your pace. You can go back and read the sentence twice. You can write in the book. There's something about holding the thing. It has more senses involved.
Yeah.
But I just hate Shakespeare. I just hate it. All the Greek playwrights are better than Shakespeare, by the way. Come at me, bro.
Love Shakespeare.
I
love Shakespeare.
Have you read the Greeks yet?
I've read some of it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's much better. But
in what regard? Because Shakespeare was never his claim to fame isn't his plot lines or anything like that. It's the language, so it's different, right? You have to you're using a different measuring stick, I think, or you have to, I guess. What? Yeah. So in what respect do you think they're superior? I'm curious.
The universality of the stories, the problems of virtue, and all that, and those are so much
sort of like the central human storyline, which is why Shakespeare cherry picked most of those.
And and me just being the kind of guy I am, like all that interpersonal drama, I got plenty of that. I don't need extra from fiction. But for some of these texts, the really sticky stuff, the stuff that's hard to get through, man, if you can find an audio book of the exact one you're reading and read and follow with your finger and listen to the thing, huge help.
Yeah, it's a
Huge
big
help.
deal.
So if you're having
Well,
having a lot of
I
trouble
mean, so
with
many of these
air
texts were
quality.
meant to be read out loud, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was one thing that surprised me was I think I was reading Augustine's Confessions, and he mentioned something about how people were making fun of someone because he read quietly, silently. Like that just
Right.
wasn't a thing. If you were going to read, you'd go walk around talking out loud to yourself, which as somebody who's really auditory, that helps me a lot to do that. But it also slows me down because you read a lot slower when you read that way. And which is, I think,
Yeah.
why I was just often discouraged in school, because we'd go at a pace that didn't make that possible.
Yeah. It's all about, cutting the books up to fit inside of a semester or inside of a term.
Yeah. Well, I love the approach, man. It's fascinating talking to you. I love your passion. I appreciate you spending a bit of time with me to dig into this topic. I think it's a one worth thinking about for that hopefully our listeners can get something out of it, and they can find more at onlinegreatbooks.com. That's the place to
us.
go. Fantastic.
As everything gets weirder and weirder, these books are unchanging and are wonderful. When you're in one of those books, it's a great place to go for a little while.
30 minutes a day. I love it. Scott, thanks
Yeah.
so
The
much.
time's so fast.